In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Oh, look at that. We're live on the internet. Hello, Sublation Media viewers and magazine readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. Welcome to the Sublation Magazine show. This is Sublation Media's weekly live stream in which we speak to authors from the magazine and discuss some of the issues of the day and their relevance for the left. Again, I'm Douglas Lane.
And I'm Ashley Frawley.
Yeah, we've got that all worked out. Hey, before we begin, I want to ask you all to like things, like this video. There's a button you can press, subscribe, hit the bell. Also, Sublation Magazine is on Twitter, so look for Sublation Magazine on Twitter and on Facebook so you can follow all of the posts that we put up when we release articles. Today, we have an article from the great and controversial Freddie DeBoer. You can go and read that. Also, there are many other articles. Also, consider supporting us on Patreon. There are links in the description, I believe, to the Patreon. And if you like to just throw money around, you can give us a super chat. When we get a super chat, I will flash whatever you say on the screen. Perhaps we'll even respond to what you say or ask. That's a possibility. Right now, we have a great show in which we'll be talking about Nancy Pelosi's recent trip to Taiwan, the Chinese reaction to the trip, and the background conditions that created such a pronounced sense of danger around her 2-day visit.
And we'll also be discussing the death of neoliberalism and the rebirth of politics, maybe, with Alex Hochuli, whose recent essay in Sublation Magazine is entitled After Anti-Politics, the Apeiron, which is a very accessible title, which I'm sure you all can immediately connect to. And we'll be talking with Alex about what that means and explore
it's
how
It's the Apeiron, right?
I'm not. See, I speak modern Greek poorly, so I often try to put, Apeiron. I don't know if I've said that correctly.
Right.
But it explores how the post-Cold War era has been defined by depoliticization and what the consequences of that depoliticization are, and how the anti-politics spurred on by the economic crisis of 2008 have dialectically produced what he calls hyperpolitics today.
But let's start out by talking about the prospects for World War III. Ashley?
Well, one indicator of a serious threat of World War III, especially when we consider how the idea of a third world war has become associated with the image of nuclear Armageddon, is the current time, according to the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol that represents the likelihood of a man-made global catastrophe, in the opinion of the members of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. By the way, we should add like a millisecond to that because apparently the Earth is spinning faster. Also in the news.
I'm not sure what the symbolic ramifications are.
Subtract. No, I think we have to add.
I don't think it's an actual clock, Ashley. So
no. I had
symbol.
To find a way to work that in because I definitely saw that on TikTok. Yes,
okay,
I know. I am ashamed.
No, it's okay.
So the time, according to the Doomsday Clock, is 1 minute and 40 seconds before midnight. And that's the closest the clock has ever been. And while Pelosi's trip to Taiwan has not moved the clock forward, it's been sitting at just over a minute to midnight since January. The trip certainly did increase the likelihood of global conflict.
Yeah, responding to Pelosi's visit, the Chinese began a series of military drills around Taiwan. They fired a couple of missiles into the South China Sea on Thursday last week. And according to the New York Times this morning, I read that around 13 warships continue to encircle the island of Taiwan even right now. It's unclear what the purpose of Pelosi's visit was. It's unclear to me. Maybe she knows. And many who are normally supportive of U.S. military action were critical. The New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman characterized the visit as reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible. And President Biden stated that the U.S. military felt the trip was not a good idea right now.
But Biden's also stated that any Chinese incursion into Taiwan would prompt a military response from the United States. You can tell they're very scared of going to war. It's the last thing on their minds.
Yeah. What I worry about is whether this visit might represent a moment when world history gets out of control. I'm not a fan of Althusser, but I worry that this idea of overdetermination might be a factor, that the conflict with China might be overdetermined so that no one factor or decision is fundamental or primary, but rather a confluence of factors, including the narcissism of Speaker Pelosi, will push us into a world historic catastrophe.
If we think about these events as overdetermined, we should include the political economy in the background. Now, I am a big, one of the things that I always say is that we shouldn't do vulgar economics, right? It's very, very difficult to say exactly what an economic driver might be. So, I warn against people just kind of like searching around, oh, here's this economic drive and here's the superstructural connection and just mash them together.
Yeah, but this morning I went ahead and just threw a bunch of indicators into our script. So,
well, no, I do think, I have been saying for a long time that indicators do point to conflict. The fact, we've been lulled into a false sense of security by this idea, of course, of mutually assured destruction. I remember Tony Blair gave a speech in, I think, 2007, where he said, we are entering a period in which we'll never have to go to war and we'll never send our children to war. And of course, he was wrong. But why was he wrong? It was this false assurance. And of course, I don't know, maybe we're being, Marxist, like doomsday people. But I do think, the underlying drivers are so powerful. And I think the fact that there is a declining rate of profit will produce a powerful drive, a drive that may see us do us. Those in power, the powers that be, do reckless things. So China is experiencing something similar to the economic crisis of 2008 right now. Their banks are facing mortgage losses of $350 billion. Confidence is plunging in their property market, and hundreds of thousands are even boycotting mortgage payments. I think it was in the Financial Times, 7% of home loans are in danger and 2.1 billion yuan are currently delinquent. And this is all happening during a slowdown in China's economic growth. And in the United States, wealth inequality is growing. We talked about this last week. Job openings are ticking down. Unemployment claims are ticking up. Inflation is at near record levels, something also I think we called a long time ago on in Sublation. And 61% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Europe's economy is in dire straits. As inflation continues, the energy crisis deepens. This is going to produce like a search. It is producing a search for new markets. Things that were not economically feasible before suddenly become necessities. An energy crisis deepens and the war in Ukraine takes its toll. So the continent looks ahead to winter with fear and trepidation.
Yeah. When you listen to Biden talk at these press conferences or watch Nancy Pelosi take her trip to Taiwan, you do get a sense that this isn't an orchestrated political machine that's functioning well, but that people are reacting to various pressures in kind of a multitude of ways, which would mean that we are more, I think, at risk of things going off the rails or decisions being made without their consequences being fully understood. I mean, the Pelosi trip itself is kind of an example of that, where, at least on the surface, it doesn't look like it was a rational decision made by the Biden administration to escalate tensions, but rather just, the decision of Pelosi for whatever political or personal reasons to make a symbolic gesture, which then had these ramifications down the road, which to me kind of supports the idea that things are overdetermined or that things are happening in a roundabout way, although I can't directly show cause and effect.
I want to be good. I want to agree. I want to say that. But, I actually have a tendency to kind of go toward conspiratorial thinking, which is why I actually overcorrect when I'm public speaking. I overcorrect and I try to really convince myself, no, it's all very complicated. But as soon as I saw this in the news, I thought, those MFers, what are they doing?
Right. So you think Biden and the Biden administration and the military really actually did want to escalate tension, but to do it in a controlled way, therefore having some plausible deniability when it came to Pelosi's trip. Is that what you would
That
suspect?
100%. Yeah.
How
I
cynical of you.
I would love to be wrong. I would love to be wrong.
Well, I mean,
but,
in a way, it doesn't matter, right? Because the
Mm.
consequences are the same either way. There would be, I mean, and probably the Chinese intelligence would know. I mean, people, which story is true, I would suspect, or at least we would hope that maybe U.S. intelligence or the U.S. military would know which is true. But either way, if it's a rational choice, or if there's some conspiracy going on, it's not outside the realm of possibility at all that some brinkmanship and political, maneuvers and setting up a plausible deniability would be a factor in this trip to Taiwan. It's hardly a grand conspiracy. But whatever the case is, in fact, you know what? If it were a conspiracy, I would feel a little bit less worried, because then it would mean that
someone's in control.
Yeah, someone had calculated the risks here and had thought it through a bit, and maybe that there's a rational plan, at least some sort of plan. But what worries me is that that there's this unthinkable solution to the world crisis, not just a political economic crisis, but a variety of other crises can be solved through, the devaluation of capital. That is, like, a world war would solve a lot of political problems in terms of population control, and also culling of the population. It would destroy a lot of capital, of course, and that could produce a boom later. And
when you say, it's very important to say population control and population problems. So don't think that the problems that
right. I mean, I'm thinking from the perspective of the rulers. Yes. Like obviously for us, the development of population problems is the best thing going. I think we want to see people organizing against the state. We want to see people standing up for their rights and being dissatisfied with their lot, especially as food shortages hit around the globe, or as wealth inequality is exacerbated in the developed world, or as precarity becomes more and more the norm. We want to see a self-organized resistance and toppling of the situation and order that creates these conditions. But for the rulers, for the governments, their whole task is to control the population, to stave off resistance and rebellion, and to create quiescence. And the world war would help in that regard, I believe. And it would also help because it would create conditions for another boom and profitability, and that itself might create some quiescence, although that's not guaranteed.
And that's the thing that's scary, is that Ted Reese, friend of the show, says the level of capital destruction that's necessary is approaching 100%. And given the weapons we have at our disposal, it's really terrifying that might happen. But what happens sometimes in these kinds of situations is that people will opt out. They may, it is possible that people may opt out of giving their lives for this horrific machine. And it's happened. Obviously, it happened in 1917, where people were like, oh, am I going to die for the Tsar? Probably not. But what's missing, of course, at the moment is a socialist left that could organize a meaningful protest, resistance against the growing likelihood of global conflict. Instead, we seem to be gearing up to take sides in a conflict between capitalist powers. And I think this has been probably one of the most, it's pretty hard to say this, but one of the most unpopular positions that I've taken. I've been, on TV talking about this recently, where begging people, just please, can we not think about this like a morality play? Can we not think about this as like the great standing up against evil. There are, when it comes to global conflict, when it comes to international relations, it is very complicated. We need to try to understand what's going on here. People were like, really just came at me, said I was doing some awful things, well, probably things that Putin might like. And, and that's really, really scary. So we are kind of following along as an overdetermined system has its way with us all.
Yeah. This might be a good segue to bring in Alex Hochuli, talk about his essay for Sublation Magazine after Anti-Politics, because that essay is about the failure, I think, of the left to organize and face up to our responsibility politically as we try to regain some mastery over this unconscious history that we're living through. So, Alex, welcome to the stream. Thanks for coming on to our show.
The scream? Is that what you said?
Just not to the screen.
Oh, okay.
Or I said the stream. I think it's you're on screen. There is a kind of a subliminal scream happening, and you're on the stream. So welcome
Excellent.
to all of the S words, which I have trouble pronouncing. So anyhow, welcome, Alex.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Delighted to be here. Though I have to say, if you're saying that the title of my essay was inaccessible, when you guys are the editors, I always expect like they're going to go for something completely different to what I've put down. I'm just throwing that in there as a placeholder.
Yeah, right.
I know. I did think of that. It's totally my fault. But here's the thing. We actually have a policy where we try to change the words of the authors as little as possible, just very, very light editing. So if you throw in placeholders, they might make it into print if we think they're defensible and we haven't come back to you. So just anybody who wants to write for us, we don't have a line. We don't change what people say. So yeah, if you put a inaccessible title, I'm just gonna be like, well, you disagree, write to us.
I'm going to say this, that the policies of the editorial team are in flux. They're overdetermined. There's low profitability going on. It's very unclear as to
the possibility of war.
Who are you going to invade?
It's unclear who's going to invade whom. But tensions are mounting. Headlines are flying. But all is calm on the surface, and we're glad to have had a chance to publish your essay. Why don't let me just start by asking you to clarify the meaning of one of the words in your piece, anti-politics, because you start off talking about post-politics, which emerged after the Cold War, not after World War II, and then the development of anti-politics. So it seems like you're saying we're still in a moment of anti-politics. What do those two terms mean?
Yeah, so I think what I've tried to do and what we did in our book, The End of History, is to bring the question of politics, whether it exists or not, into question, right? Because a lot of the discussion, of course, is about populism, right? Or technocracy, managerialism, these kind of terms. But these are all different forms of kind of responding to the situation in which politics has been defeated. And it was defeated because there was no more workers' movement, which effectively sustains and actually brings politics into being. Without that contestation from below, you just get elite factions fighting between themselves or questions of administration. So you need that major opposition to how society is run to bring politics into question, right? To bring politics into being.
Politics doesn't mean the sort of narrow definition of like electoral politics. You mean politics as like the contestation over how things are run, who gets what.
Exactly. So it's not like a space of politics where does politics happen? It happens in Congress or the House of the Parliament or in other government buildings and so on. Politics actually happens on the streets, happens in workplaces, happens in many different places, but not always. For politics to exist, there needs to be some contestation over the direction of society, over the conditions of how we live, even in the most fundamental sense. And without that, you basically just get administration. So the idea is to distinguish politics in a kind of thoroughgoing sense of people trying to take charge of their lives collectively versus the administration of things as they are, which is the job of the state as it is when it runs unperturbed by challenges from below. So that was effectively you can say politics existed from 1789 to 1989, to make it quite neat, from the French Revolution until the fall of the Berlin Wall, or certainly 1848, from the 1848 revolutions till 1989. The end of the Cold War brings in this period where elites rule more or less unchallenged. They don't have the threat from outside in terms of the Soviet Union existing as a real possible alternative. However decrepit the Soviet Union was by the end, it still represented the possibility of an alternative to capitalism. What happened in that period was the development of post-politics, which is a strategy for depoliticization, right? So it's removing key elements of what was policy out of contestation. So it basically severs politics and policy, right? So politics being this serious contestation over the future of society, and policy being, its implementation. And you think politics comes first, you decide what the will of the people is, and then you implement it through policies. Those things become separate. The will of the people is completely secondary or completely neglected, and policy just rules policy continues according to the whims of elites. So post-politics was that, but I think it's important to say that it's a foreclosure of politics. It's not just trying to say, hey, can we do politics in these narrow bounds of what's possible in Congress or in Parliament, right? So you have competition between center-left and center-right, as you had through a lot of the post-war period. It's actually a more fundamental prohibition of politics. And it does that by putting key decision-making outside of the realms of democratic accountability. So like independent central banks, key issue, how do you set interest rates, has huge economic effects. That's no longer something that is within the control of citizens, because it's independent, right? And there's a whole other range of quangos and other ways in which politics is moved from beyond the control of ordinary citizens. So that's post-politics. What happens in what is, I think now lots of people call it even the populist decade of the 2010s, and that's the fact that there is an increasingly angry rejection of political establishments. So whereas in the 90s and 2000s, people weren't really tuned in to what was going on politically, that was for nerds. That was like for nerds like me who were interested in politics. But for most people, you tuned out, you set about, doing home improvement or gardening or whatever else, or acting, if you're like on the left, doing some subcultural thing, which you think is really alternative and is going to transform society or create a new alternative space for prefiguring the future. And it leads to nothing, obviously.
And at that time as well, too, people were lamenting the fact that people had become turned off from politics, that people were politically apathetic. And then as I suppose you'll say now, that's sort of come to an end, and everyone's saying, oh, no, actually not like that. We wanted to get you really excited about this new policy to, I don't know, do something in schools or something. But now, what you're talking about Brexit?
It's like, have your say. Whoa, not like that. So there's this hilarious to and fro that happened sometime, after the global financial crisis in many different societies, where politicians are trying to engage people because they feel that no one's paying attention. And then suddenly when people act, they vote for Trump, or they vote for Brexit, or whatever, vote for some populist who is not, approved of by the establishment. Then suddenly the people's entry into politics, people's engagement and seek for some alternative, then kind of breeds this really hostile rejection from the establishment, who go, how are people allowed to do this? And then they think that they might be better off electing a new people rather than vice versa. But so,
let me just ask one quick question about politics. So, in your story, you're saying that politics has sort of reemerged, or perhaps, or certainly after Cold War ended, the politics is, as defined by 1848, went away. But I'm a little unclear as to what counts as politics still, because I just remember in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, for example, there was massive amounts of protests around the world. It was probably it was historic in terms of how many people hit the streets to protest the invasion of Iraq. Even the Desert Storm had a massive protest in the United States by historical standards. I mean, it was a lot of unrest. Or more recently, the reaction to George Floyd, or the LA riots in the 90s. There were these moments where the people hit the streets, whether in an organized, peaceful fashion to protest, or by rioting. And there was political expression in these moments. There have been kind of direct political expressions which the public, which the politicians have to react to, have to do something about. Does that not count as politics when you've got millions of people?
I mean, I don't think it doesn't necessarily, right? But there's tend to be sporadic. I think with a lot of these things, there's in some ways manifests a belief that things won't actually change. And more fundamentally, because that's a bit speculative, the vehicles for politics aren't really there for actually transmitting that will through to the state, or at any rate to, for example, create the sort of blockades necessary to end the Iraq war. So there's these mass demonstrations and people showing their feelings of how they don't want this to happen, not in my name. But even that slogan seems to say, this isn't to do with me, right? Count me out, rather than this won't happen. And I think, yeah, more fundamentally, it's the absence of vehicles for politics to actually happen, for actual organizations. So they actually end up being quite sporadic. And one of the weird things is that protest, the number of protests actually increases over the kind of end of history period. And that's kind of paradoxical, right? Because you think, well, okay, protests are obviously political, and you're saying, Alex, that politics doesn't suddenly went away, and at the same time there's more protests. Okay, so this guy's full of shit, right? This can't be right. But I think that's a paradox to be explained. I think it's the absence of any of the usual vehicles through which you would have politics, whether that's engagement in your trade union, in your workplace, or being membership of a political party, where politics often happens not as these necessarily big explosions and confrontations and protests, but as a steady kind of ticking over and building and organizing and so on. And in the absence of that, the only way people can give expression to their frustration is through these moments of protest, but they end up being incredibly evanescent. And proof of that is, I think, and this is why I think what I'm saying is true, at least with regard to that, is that the proof is in history, which is the ultimate judge, that they didn't actually succeed in any way. And that not only did they not succeed, but they seem to leave no real trace for the future. So it's not like a failed revolution, which then gets redeemed by a successful revolution in the future. They happen, and then it disappears, and then it moves on to the next current thing. And the issue of war kind of disappears, as we actually witnessed, right? There wasn't, the anti-war movement now is arguably weaker than it was in the mid 2000s, which is strange, right? So just to return to the question of what anti-politics is, because that's where we started, it's that there's suddenly this angry rejection of politics and political establishment. So it's different from the post-politics, where the establishment goes kind of, you're not going to have a say over anything important, and people at the same time withdraw and kind of go, well, I'm going to tend to my own private affairs. And anti-politics, like, wait, hang on, things are really not working, and the people who are at fault are the establishment, our politicians, our political parties, anything associated with politics. And as a consequence, things like journalism, the media, even the legal system, for example, get attacked as representatives of the elite, right? So it's not necessarily tackling or targeting kind of big capital, for example, but it's directed very politically as the people responsible for this situation that we're in. Now, what's kind of, again, seemingly paradoxical is that anti-politics actually ends up politicizing society, because it's a first moment, I think, after the global financial crisis, and you can chart it through a series of events like Occupy, the occupation of the squares in Southern Europe, eventually Trump and Brexit, and various other forms of protest, that in denouncing the political establishment, create a division in society and create a sense of us and them. And that's fundamental to any politics. I don't think it's a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition. And so that ends up bringing politics back in, ironically, but leaves us in this perplexing and kind of perverse situation in which we're all saying, no, you don't represent us. You're not our politicians. We don't believe in you. We don't believe in what you say. We're not taking this shit anymore. But at the same time, we have nothing else to put in its place. No real banner to rally around. It's not like we're saying, well, and then we're going to have socialist revolution, or we're going to have a democratic revolution, or we're going to put in place a kind of nationalist government in its place. There's none of that. It's just a gathering of people in protest, denouncing the establishment without any, banner to rally around, or for that matter, any real factional struggles within those protest movements, between socialists and Democrats and liberals and nationalists, all trying to gain control or rather assert leadership over this, mass of people. So that's what's kind of at the one time political and at the same time not quite political at the same time.
Do you think we're still kind of, just as you're talking, it occurred to me, do you think we're kind of still stuck in that Occupy moment where we see the problem as being organization and leaders, and so there was this celebration of leaderlessness, but of course, if you have no leaders and no organization, then you don't go anywhere, right? There's no head, there's no direction. Do you think there's maybe still a whiff of that going on in some of our movements and how we look at things? I didn't think that there was, but now that you say it, I can see that with some protests that have come up.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends where you are. I think a lot of people were burned by that experience. And I think the kind of what is called like the left populist moment behind Bernie Sanders, behind Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's probably the only remaining one who has could claim any degree of relative success in terms of at least permanence. But Corbyn, Podemos in Spain, etc., Syriza in Greece, that there was a kind of return to leadership, but it was leadership not in the intellectual sense of providing a body of ideas for people, but literally just a guy. I think they're all our guys actually, who are like a leader, and he's a leader not of an organization which is hierarchically organized, and you have cadres and local branches and so on. But it's just like, I've signed a petition, or I've signed up to the party online, and that's my only connection. So there's no real mediation or way of holding that leader accountable for the policies that he might pursue should he be elected. So I think there's. In that regard, there was a return to leadership and organization, but it often happened in a way in which either there were new parties formed, which I think is more productive in the case of Spain or Greece, for example, or France for that matter, which in France, like France Insoumise, the Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, has become kind of hegemonic on the left. So for whatever that shows, but. Whereas in Britain and the US, they kind of flowed into the existing establishment center-left party, and that's center-left at best, right? In the case of certainly of the Democrats, and that ended up kind of neutering that, because you're getting into bed with the enemy effectively within the same party. So I think there was a return to that. I don't know if we're at this kind of a moment of kind of leaderless protest. I think to a certain extent, there's been a kind of rollback, but that's because of the sense of defeat and hopelessness that has ensued from kind of post 2019, when that kind of left populist moment more or less hit the wall everywhere.
So if I could just kind of recap the argument then. So 1789 to 1989, this is the era of politics. This is when the real stuff is contested. You have real existing socialism, at least for some of that time. And, who gets what, how things will be organized, that's on the table of politics. 1989 kind of throws that out, and there's everything becomes really depoliticized. There's this period of depoliticization. What you can argue about are these kind of small things, but, don't start talking about money and all that. So when does that end? So that's the era of post-politics. Does that end in 2016? And we enter the era of anti-politics?
Yeah, basically. I mean, these things aren't marked by any kind of, collective
I'm looking
event.
For a strict periodization.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so we'll go 2016. No, and that's what we do in the book as well. So, I mean, it is, Trump and Brexit, because that they're in the very kind of core of the capitalist world and mark pretty radical departures from what had come before. We can see as the moment that the sort of post politics really comes to an end, and there's no longer any capacity for elites to kind of go, yeah, we're just kind of going to manage things, put the experts in charge, and people will be quiet or whatever. Suddenly, there needs to be a new way of engaging people, and I think what emerges, and this is something that I broached in the article, is like culture war as a means of responding to people, because suddenly there's a huge influx into political debate, often online, and with all the problems that brings for the nature of kind of discourse that happens on the internet, but of people kind of taking sides, of people staking a claim, of people saying that they are, identifying themselves politically in a certain way, saying, I'm a liberal, or I'm a nationalist, or whatever, in ways that implicate a lot more people than it did before. And I think anybody could attest to this if they think of their friendship groups or acquaintances, unless you're like in a complete bubble of depoliticized people or already politicized people, that you've experienced friends of yours who never gave a crap about politics, weren't interested in when you would go on about what was politically important or interesting, or what was going on, or outrage about something, they would kind of roll their eyes and be like, that's them being interested in politics, but who cares, whereas now there's people who are deeply feel like deeply implicated in the fighting the struggle against whatever the populists, or conversely against the liberal establishment, or whatever it might be, in a way that I think they weren't before. I think people would recognize that kind of transition that's happened.
So this yeah, sorry, go ahead.
How important is the Soviet Union, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, to your understanding of politics? Because you mentioned it at the outset that and it keeps coming back. 1989, that was the moment where politics, the age of politics, ended. And it seems to me that inherent in that is this idea that there was a true political difference between the Soviet world and the world of really existing socialism, and the West and the capitalist world. And I, as an ultra leftist or infantile communist or whatever you want, I question that.
But it doesn't matter whether it does or not. I mean, I think this is the point, that it was symbolically important, that people's conception of the world, even if you're not particularly politicized or well-read or whatever, you have some sense that the world is divided into East and West, and that there's a capitalist countries and then there's the socialist countries. It doesn't matter whether that's real socialism, whether that in any way even came close to realizing the aims and aspirations of 1917.
Well, okay, if that's the case, then why can't there be a division between the West and the terrorist nations, the rogue nations? Why can't there be a division between the West and Russia, or the West and China? Why can't we just find another polarized conflict situation to set up our politics symbolically?
Yeah. I mean, there's people who argue that the return of geopolitical competition between big blocs will repoliticize things, and it might. But I think, my argument is that, because the symbol matters, it's the promise of an alternative which is there, right? Represented by Soviet Union, really existing socialism in Eastern Europe, which China, for all the misunderstandings that there are, I don't think exactly has. It doesn't, it's on a road to socialism, and that's, by its own proclamation. I don't know how many people actually buy that. So I don't know. We could speculate about where China's future development will take it, and whether that will provide that sense of the existence of an alternative to capitalism. But I think people are aware of the story of China's reforms from the 80s onwards, and the fact that it is a major capitalist power. So I don't know if it has the same symbolic value.
It seems to me that some of this return of global conflict, or the potential return of global conflict, I feel like it wasn't received with as much trepidation as one would hope. Kind of reminds me of, how people characterize the reception of the First World War. It was like, oh, great, nothing important has happened. And now it's like this return of history, but this kind of like farcical return of history because no one actually stands for anything. And I wonder if it's like that symbol that people are attracted to, where it's like, aha, here we go. Here's the evil we can defend.
And I think that here we go thing is incredibly dangerous. Like, I mean, I'm against a lot of these kind of cheap historical comparisons. Like, oh, today is actually exactly like 1938 and the Nazis are blah, 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 all that kind of crap, right? Or that it's the years of lead in Italy and, whatever, trying to understand what is actually a completely unprecedented situation that we find ourselves in, precisely because of I think the core of the argument that I make, that you have the return of politics at a time when you don't have mass politics, right? You don't have people integrating into organizations, and that has so many kind of feed through effects to the rest of society, down to kind of cultural level, that that's what is really unprecedented about our situation, right? But the one analogy which I think might be a little bit useful is to think of ourselves more in like 1913, 1912 kind of thing, just because it's similarly the end of a liberal order which seemed peaceful, right? There was war, plenty of war, perma war, right? over the past 2 decades. But that perma war was far away. It only happened on TV, effectively. It was hyper real. And they were wars of choice. So that kind of distance that people feel, the lack of conscription or, kind of mass implication for most people, even in the US, the death toll from soldiers in Iraq was nothing comparable to Vietnam, for example. So that sense of, bringing the war home, I think is impossible when it's something that's perpetuated by professional armies in a faraway country. And in that regard, the similarity with 1913, I guess, would be that you have, the scramble for Africa and this huge wave of imperialism from 1870 until 1913, and that's all a distant thing. And then suddenly that barbarism comes home, and people cheer it on. Socialists end up cheering it on, and that's the Ur disaster of the 20th century, I think, because it all so much else kind of feeds on from there, and that's what's really concerning about today. So one thing which is like, sometimes beggars belief is the trite way that leading politicians even treat these matters. And so even the modes of like online discourse interaction, Twitter trolling and whatever, have now come back into formal politics at the highest level, right? So I think this happened over the weekend. I didn't see it on Twitter, but I read about it in the Financial Times today, which is I think telling in itself that the Financial Times is reporting on what is effectively like a Twitter spat. But the Chinese associated to the Chinese state tweeted that, obviously Taiwan is Chinese. Look at the number of Chinese restaurants there are on in Taipei, and like listed the number of restaurants from different areas of mainland China, as a claim effectively to sovereignty. And then people responded back going, oh, well, does that mean that everywhere with the McDonald's is part of the American empire or whatever, right? And there's something like, well, that is just completely kind of farcical for a thing to be happening if we're on the verge of World War III, effectively, as your discussion earlier attested to, right? And then the newspapers report this back as if it were news itself, rather than itself a kind of mediation on something else. So you get this kind of hyperreal sense which I think allows citizens, and even more so politicians, to pretend that we still live in this kind of world where nothing really matters, right? Where like nothing will really ever come home. There won't be any real impact to this. And that's why with thinking about conflict with Russia, conflict with China, conflict even between like NATO and NATO-aligned powers and a new Chinese-Russian bloc with a couple of others along the way, Iran, whoever else, that is very frightening, and it's still treated in a kind of trite social media way that, that to the extent that even social media trolling becomes part of geopolitical competition, that's the kind of propaganda that's being played out, and not just propaganda for domestic consumption, because you can easily go, oh, haha, we trolled the Chinese, the Americans go, we trolled the Chinese on Twitter, haha, don't you guys like this, right? And it plays to the anti-China constituency in the US, but it's actually like being played out for a global audience too, right? It's not just for domestic consumption. And I think that's really concerning. And I think that element of transition from the kind of era of the end of history, where nothing really mattered unless you happen to be like Iraq or Yemen or whoever, right, who's on the receiving end, to a situation where war becomes a much more real and present thing, which might implicate all citizens in a way that it just hasn't over the end of history period.
I want to throw something up on the screen, which is going to be super obvious.
Actually, sorry, let me just clarify something, because I'm referring here to like Western society. So because people will say, no, but what are you talking about? There was skirmish, between India and Pakistan or whatever, where I live, etc. But I want to say that, in the core Western powers, that's where, that's been the general sense that war has been something that happens on your TV screen and exclusively there.
Well, okay, here's what I'm going to throw on the screen. This is the thumbnail for our show. Right? It's a reference to Squid Game. For some reason or other, this conversation about the potential for World War III, is being advertised as with Squid Game. And that the reason why is because in your article, you mentioned the politicization of everything, and including Squid Game being somehow important or being a way to talk about our political situation. And it occurred to me that the very tone of our show at the beginning and the way it's being advertised participates in this sort of notion that really nothing's going to affect us. We're not. This is all the internet simulation, and we can joke around about it, and it's fine, and we're not sincerely threatened, and we
all do it. It's hard to break out of like that. It's not something where I'm like going, oh, you people over there being completely flippant and I'm here being serious about it. It's like you get trapped back into it. You post jokes on Twitter about what Xi Jinping was wearing or whatever, right? You get drawn into it.
Yeah, but why is it that explain this idea that the anti-politics and the taking up of anti-politics has led to the politicization of everything, and yet the trivialization of politics at the same time. And if you maybe you've already explained this, and I just need to remember, but how is hyperpolitics connected to this kind of thumbnail? I mean, how is hyperpolitics? Is this a postmodern notion, or come from Bolyar, if that's how you say his name, this hyper reality, hyper politics, that kind of thing? Is that what we're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not. I already used the term hyper real. Where you're unable to distinguish reality from the simulacra of reality from its representation, and so it all seems kind of fake. The Iraq War didn't really happen, as Baudrillard famously pronounced. That it only happened on your TV screen, effectively. And hypermedia, I think, is a term that I use as well. I think we live in a hypermediatized world because it's in our screens constantly. We're being constantly advertised to. It's very much part of our imaginary. Even when we do politics, the media, the media strategy comes before what else you might want to achieve. So you're like, okay, let's do a protest. Okay, we got to make sure that we do the live stream and that we call this reporter to report on it, and so the whole world can get to know about it, rather than actually starting off with what your objectives are. We want to recruit new people, or we want to, like literally overrun this institution and take charge of it, whatever it might be. So the media strategy comes first. So I think, hyperreality and hypermedia are terms that I would use. Hyperpolitics is something that actually was introduced by my friend Anton Jaeger in these discussions, and we've kind of had some back and forth on it over various different media, on our podcast, on Bungacast, elsewhere at some of our events, and so on. And I'm not entirely convinced by the term, just because it suggests a kind of level of politicization which we haven't actually reached today. That what politics is somehow kind of nascent today, that things are increasingly strained, increasingly subject to dispute, at all levels of society, whether it's, you know, debating the meaning of Squid Game with your aunt at home, or you know, climate change, right, to kind of the biggest levels. But because I don't think you could say, for example, that today is more politicized than interwar Europe was, where, you know, there were huge masses of people in the workers' movement and communist parties confronting the state. There was the rise of fascism, you know, that effectively there were masses of people on the streets, a kind of density to the kind of real social networks in civil society that just don't exist today. And so I'm a little bit skeptical about suggesting that we live in a hyper political time. What I wanted to communicate, I guess, is this sort of boundlessness of politics, where on the one hand, it seems everywhere and quite intense, but at the same time, nowhere, because it's not rooted in determinate politics, in determinate parties or organizations, or even places, right? I mean, I wrote this thing like 2 years ago now, what is it, about the global BLM moment, where there was this kind of participation in Europe and further afield in the Black Lives Matters protests, which had seeming no connection to the specific contradictions and racism or lack thereof in their own societies, or the precise forms that racism and discrimination might take. And it was just an importation of the American lens of understanding these things. And I think that is also part of the story, where you have this kind of return of politics. Young people or Zoomers are out on the streets protesting, but engaging in someone else's politics, as if place, you know, no longer really matters. And so that's the kind of what I wanted to communicate in this very pretentious adoption of an ancient Greek phrase, to kind of try to capture this sense of boundlessness, lack of limit, the way that it's all kind of free floating. It creates these oppositions, you know, over whatever the current thing is, which itself is a current thing. You know, the use of the term current thing to describe whatever is like dominating headlines and in the discourse at the moment, whatever's trending on Twitter and you know, TikTok or whatever. That current thing then just disappears, and whatever opposition was ranged around that, you know, whatever two poles were contesting that, then disappear and are gone the next day, and there's a new thing that pops up. So I think that's the kind of perplexing thing about contemporary politics, that politics is back, but without its traditional vehicles, kind of mass organizations to carry through politics, which means that politics has returned, but returned in the form of hypermedia. So it's returned in the form of this very mediatized sort of discourse, rather than proceeding effectively from, you know, local to national, through your, you know, party branch up to the party leadership, from the union, your local branch upwards, and so on, right? And so that's why it's all seeming disconnected, unrooted, free floating.
You know, you probably know that this is one of my favorite quotes because I use it all the time and it's such a cliche, but the line from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where Marx says, Hegel remarks somewhere that the great personages of history occur, as it were, twice, but he forgot to mention first his tragedy, then his farce. So I went on this little, I'm trying to be optimistic here. I went on this little quest to find where Hegel says that great things happen twice. And I did manage to find that Hegel says that the great things in history have to happen twice before they're accepted. And Marx flips this upside down and he says the horrible things have to happen twice before we leave them behind. And I wonder if politics needs to happen twice before we can bring it to fruition. And maybe the farcical way that we're treating World War is so that we can laugh at ourselves as we leave it in the past. That's my attempt to be very, very optimistic. Do you have optimism for a return of politics in a kind of triumphant way?
Yeah, I mean, I do, though I have to say I waver. I need someone to fortify my optimism or something. There's a tendency, I think, like a temptation, I guess, in, you know, wanting the return of politics, not because you're into politics and you're, no, but because effectively social improvement, to have a better life for yourself, for your peers, for your family, whatever, actually depend on the possibility of politics. the possibility of contestation over the future of the fundamental ways of organizing society, because what we have now does not work. And I think this is now, at the very least, an open secret in the way that it wasn't before. There could be a pretense that things kind of can carry on. They're not great, but they can. Now there's I think across the world, probably, at least in most societies, a sense of this cannot continue the way this is. And the rise of inflation now has, I think, really made that very real. At the same time, I'm wary of looking for a sort of deus ex machina to come in and be like, oh, now shit's real, right? Now there's war, so now you have to take things seriously, right? As the kind of discussion we've just been having about Twitter and, trolling, China trolling about Taiwan and the West responding and whatever, shows that even through kind of the worst barbarism, you can still be on social media laughing about it. So I'm a little bit reluctant to look for that kind of thing which is real, which suddenly kind of intercedes in your life and it makes it all real. Especially if it doesn't implicate all people, and not just in an individual level, but in a collective sense. Ironically, I think if they try, if leading states try to implement mass conscription, for example, that might be one of those things that really throws us into a whole new period, into a new period of history with a capital H, where there is, again, serious contestation over the future of society, because that people will be forced into huge agglomerations of people. And most of Western politics over the past, and not just Western politics actually, but over the past 30 years has been an exercise in trying to atomize people, to stop them joining together and finding themselves in the same situation. And I'm not suggesting that that people have been fed TV shows as a way of distracting them. It's not like which is almost a bit like boomerish now to say, or Gen Xer. Doug, you're the you're the expert here. But like,
how
TV
dare you?
Watching the masses,
how dare you? But
I
yes,
say this
you're
because
right.
we
It's a very
discussed this
Gen X
before.
thing
I'm
to
not
say.
just.
Yeah.
I'm not just phoning. I'm not
No,
just
the
phoning
people
you
who
up.
watch TV, they're like the book readers of the past now.
Right.
Yeah, right.
No, exactly. But anyway, even those kind of things are ways of kind of turning your experience inward and disconnecting you from other people. So already, I think the experience of rising interest rates and yet another kind of blow on the back of the working class, in a very immediate sense, is something that I think will stimulate further turbulence and hopefully further resistance. I think I've already seen some of this, in the UK, some strikes, a new campaign, I think, by some of the unions saying enough is enough. And I think that's very promising, early days, but it's promising. And I think what's important, I think, that just about that question of inflation and people hitting people in their pocketbook and consumption, I think is very important to look at historically, because the legitimacy of Western states has been basically consumerism, has been, access to the consumer's republic. So, states demand nothing of you. There's no sense of duty. There's no real sense of patriotism in the old ways of things, not least because that might, rely on having a standing army, and they don't want that either, because you can just have professional armies carrying out war. And if you have, mass conscription armies, then that creates resistance, because, body bags start coming home, and that tends to breed revolt. So, in that situation in which you don't really have, you have an increasingly atomized society, the question of consumption becomes important, because that's your access to, effectively access to society, right? That's how you participate in things. Previously you could say that, rising wages and conditions, being able to buy a fridge and then a TV and whatever, that was the kind of post-war American model of integration. And that then becomes replaced by one based much more narrowly on consumption, not by rising wages, but really by cheapening goods, made possible by the Chinese state's repression of the Chinese working class and keeping their wages down to create cheap goods, which flow westward, to the West and allow you to, buy a TV, buy 2 TVs, buy 3 TVs. And I say TVs not because we were talking about it before, but it's one of the commodities, consumer commodities, which has most fallen in price over recent years, while, the cost of health or education, where those are commercialized, or various other goods have increased. Now,
I just want to say, as an old Gen Xer, that the idea that, televisions dropped in price in the 20th century and became common for people to have more than one, have 2 or 3 TVs. But certainly by the 80s, it was fairly common for people to have. But they were tube TVs, right? So what happened was, now these more high-tech HD TVs I've heard about. I don't know anything about them. I've never seen one. But let's say that that they exist. They've been cheapening as well. So it's a replay in a way of the consumer society, which emerged mostly in the West, is now spreading throughout the world in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Would that be?
Yeah, no, that's right. But I think what's important is that if you were, unionized, you had some say over your workplace, or at least some means for channeling your interests, or at the very least that there was a kind of corporatist arrangement where the state would make sure that wages rose just to keep people happy and pacified and whatever, right? And also be able to consume the products that they produce, maybe. That stops happening, right? Everybody knows I think now what's it called? The crocodile graph, where productivity continues to rise and wages have remained stagnant. That's a US graph, but it applies, applies in the UK very strongly over the past kind of 10, 15 years. Wages are stagnant, or even real wages are stagnant, or even lower than they were before. So in that situation, I think people's remaining connection to the public sphere, other than social media, is through consumption, right? And then if suddenly that gets blocked off, then it's like, well, now there's nothing, right? Now there's no more somehow access to society, and I think that will provoke, and we're already seeing that, provoke sort of new ructions, protests, and resistance. And I think that's one way to be optimistic.
All right, so I hope that you're right. Although I worry that because of the uneven way in which these things are felt, that it will not, that it will instead only confirm or accelerate conflict between nations as these things fall apart, rather than bring us together in a unified workers' struggle.
That's definitely true. I think at the national level, though, at least, this is one of those rare moments over the past 30 years, bar the pandemic, where there is a political event in the broadest sense that implicates everyone, right? And it implicates those at the bottom 70% of society, who spend a greater share of their income on energy and food and the basics. Impacts them all universally, right? Everyone feels it, and everyone feels it to the same degree. And that's a shared experience, which can be quite powerful in mobilizing people to get together and to fight that. And the pandemic was the last thing that actually did that, but that was in such a negative way because people were told to stay at home. So it impeded in many ways the possibility for joining up with other people. But I agree that at the international level, it's deeply concerning. And I think the only thing that we can draw upon to think that maybe this might act as a brake on great power conflict is the fact that a lot of people across Western societies say they would not go to fight for their country. In Western Europe, the percentages are really low, like 15, 20% or something like that.
Where to wouldn't they go? To the Ukraine?
Just in general, like in surveys that pose the question, would you fight for your country? And, the number is like 75% in Finland, which of course, has had kind of mass conscription, has had, national defense plans as ways of, deterring any Russian invasion for ages. So that's kind of an exceptional case. Turkey, which has kind of been permanently at war with its Kurdish minority, that's also around 75%. But if you look at Germany, France, the UK, Spain, and so on, the numbers are much, much lower. And maybe that's a reflection of a sense of resignation or lack of identification with the nation, which is a kind of double-edged sword. But at any rate, if there's a major war, maybe that will, people won't dive into that kind of willingly, because that martial spirit perhaps existed in 1913, and it kind of motivated people's engagement to gleefully throw themselves into this war, which will be over by Christmas supposedly, and so on. And that's absent today.
Just let a couple of bombs drop on any of these nations, and you'll see a complete change in people's attitudes. I think I just remember 9/11 and the patriotism that ripped through all the ideologies of the United States. And so
never underestimate the capacity for horror waiting for us.
Yeah. But I don't mean to just be a naysayer. Maybe you're correct. That is an interesting step.
We were saying that right before we went live. We were saying, hey, maybe the apathy and the lack of identification with those in power can turn out to be a good thing when they want us to go and die for their causes.
Yeah. I know. I just somehow in my bones I feel unconvinced by that idea. But
I think the condition of it is that it's like the war happens nowhere, right? Like yes, 9/11 happened, right? And people living in, a tiny town in, Iowa felt like very intimately threatened. But, the retaliation against that, the war in Afghanistan, then the war in Iraq and so on, were kind of done on the condition that it wouldn't implicate the average citizen. And I think this is what we're talking about here, at least the kind of horrible scenario that we're imagining would be rather different.
Well, yeah, like I said to my husband when this started happening, because he's Greek, right? And I was like, ooh, this is kind of like coming close to home here. And I was like, no matter what narrative they put up, like, oh, fight for the Greek nation, there's no chance that I am losing my husband or my family to some horrific imperialist struggle. No, thank you. And I can't imagine, I like to think I'm a normie, and I can't imagine that other people feel differently. I do. I have faith in our hatred for elites at the moment. Hopefully will carry us through.
Well,
on that optimistic note, we do need to go because we have to carry this on in the Patreon. People are getting the good stuff for free, Doug.
Oh yeah, you're right. Alex, can you join us?
We do live in a capitalist society. Of
course.
Still.
Okay, great. So in about 20 minutes at around 10:30, we'll start the stream for patrons only. If you can wait that long, Alex, do you have that amount of time? Okay.
Sorry to spring that on you. I do that all the time.
Yeah, we do that to everybody. Like, hey, stick around again and help us with generating cash.
I famously can't say no to a party being extended. So I'm
grab a beer.
Great.
And we'll get into it.
I will grab more coffee. And thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm going to run the outro, which is the same as the intro, and catch us in the Patreon Parrot Room after show party with Alex, who can't wait for it. Okay, here we go.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout,